Wipe it up. The young woman's voice rang out in the middle of the luxurious ballroom at the Astoria Hotel. The music was still playing, but several people nearby had already turned to look. On the polished marble floor, a line of spit had just landed right in front of the shoes of Elijah Grant. Elijah lowered his eyes and looked at the spit for a second, not out of embarrassment, but as if he were considering something. Then he lifted his head. His face was so calm that the silence around them suddenly felt heavy. The person who had done it was Sophie Whitman, the famous heiress of Whitman Industries. Her bright red dress made her stand out among the sea of expensive tuxedos in the room. Sophie crossed her arms, her gaze cold. A waiter daring to stand in the VIP section? A few laughs broke out behind her. Elijah didn't bend down. He didn't explain. He simply looked straight at her. Sophie frowned, irritated by the silence. I told you to wipe it. Phones began to rise. The entire room waited to see how this man would react. None of them recognized Elijah Grant, and even fewer knew that the man they had just laughed at was the very person holding a decision that could make the Whitman empire disappear from Wall Street overnight. Sophie still stood there, arms folded across her chest, waiting for the man in front of her to bend down. The spit on the floor reflected the sparkling chandelier light, like an uncomfortable pause in a room full of laughter. Elijah Grant did not bend down. He simply looked at Sophie, his calm gaze making a few people nearby start to feel uneasy. One of Sophie's friends laughed loudly. Maybe he doesn't understand English. Another girl raised her phone. Wait, let me record this. This video is definitely going to go viral. Sophie smirked. See? Everyone's waiting for you to do your job. Elijah tilted his head slightly. His voice was low but clear. I heard everything you said. That simple reply made several people around them pause. Sophie frowned. She wasn't used to this kind of response. Usually, all it took was a glance from her and people would rush to apologize. Then wipe it, she said slowly, each word sounding like an order. Elijah didn't move. The room grew slightly quieter. No one understood why, but the calmness of this man had begun to shift the atmosphere. Across the room, a woman in a black suit suddenly stopped when she saw Elijah. It was Caroline Reed, the communications director of Whitman Industries. At first, she had simply been walking past, but when she looked closely at the man standing in front of Sophie, her expression immediately changed. Caroline turned sharply. She hurried toward Charles Whitman, who was speaking with several investors at the far end of the room. Mr. Whitman, she said quietly but urgently, we have a problem. Charles frowned slightly. What is it? Caroline glanced toward Elijah. The man Sophie is causing trouble with? You need to look right now. Charles turned his head. When his eyes landed on Elijah Grant's face, the smile on his lips vanished instantly. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then the color drained from his face. My God, he muttered. Caroline spoke quietly. Yes, that's Elijah Grant. Charles Whitman felt his throat go dry. He knew that name all too well. The CEO of Novagrid, the man who owned the fastest-growing clean energy company in the United States, and also the man currently negotiating to acquire Whitman Industries in a deal worth more than $3 billion. Charles immediately walked quickly toward his daughter, but when he approached, Sophie still hadn't realized anything. She looked at Elijah with annoyance. Are you planning to stand there all night? One of her friends cut in. Hey, If you don't want to lose your job, you'd better do what she says." A few laughs broke out again. Charles Whitman stepped between them. "Sophie." She turned around. "What is it, Dad?" "That's enough." Sophie looked confused. "What are you talking about?" Charles turned to Elijah, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Grant, I apologize for this misunderstanding." Sophie's group of friends fell silent. Sophie looked at her father, then at Elijah. "Wait," she blinked. "Grant?" For the first time, she studied Elijah's face carefully. "You are Elijah Grant?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at Charles Whitman. "Mr. Whitman?" His voice was calm, without a trace of anger. That calmness only made Charles more tense. "My daughter didn't know who you were," Charles said quickly. "It was just a misunderstanding." Sophie still wasn't convinced. "Dad, he was just—" Charles turned to her, his voice lowering. "Sophie, be quiet." It was the first time in many years he had spoken to his daughter in that tone. Sophie was so surprised she couldn't say anything. A few guests began whispering. "What's going on?" "I think that's Elijah Grant." "The CEO of Novagrid?" "Oh my God." Phones began vibrating in several people's hands. One of the guests looked at his screen and said quietly, "The video from earlier is already online." Someone asked, "What video?" "The one with Sophie, just now." The man swallowed. "It already has more than 200,000 views." Sophie spun around. "What?" She grabbed her friend's phone. On the screen was the video recorded just a few minutes earlier. The image of her spitting in front of Elijah, the laughter of her friends, and the calm expression of the man standing there. The comments were increasing by the second. One comment pinned at the top read, "You just insulted the CEO of Novagrid." Sophie felt her heart start beating faster. "This is ridiculous," she said, trying to maintain confidence. Charles turned to Elijah. "I think we should talk in private." Elijah shook his head slightly. "That won't be necessary." Charles forced a smile. "We're in the middle of a gala. This isn't the right place for—" Elijah interrupted. "Mr. Whitman." The room fell silent again. "Elijah Grant didn't come here tonight to argue." He looked straight at Charles. "I came to see whether your company was worth saving." That sentence made several people nearby look surprised. Charles tried to remain composed. "What are you talking about?" Elijah turned toward the large screen in the ballroom. "Would you mind if I used the screen for a minute?" Charles hadn't even answered yet. Elijah had already signaled to a technician. Within seconds, the large screen in the ballroom lit up. At first, it showed a map. Then a series of documents appeared. Environmental reports, satellite images, chemical transport records. The room began to murmur. Charles Whitman looked up at the screen and felt a chill run down his spine. Elijah spoke slowly. "For the past 6 years, Whitman Industries has transported more than 3,000 tons of industrial waste to poor residential communities in Louisiana." Several guests gasped. "The official reports say it was properly processed." Elijah looked at Charles. "But satellite data tells a different story." On the screen appeared images of trucks dumping waste into a field near a residential area. The room grew noisy. Sophie looked at her father. "Dad?" Charles didn't answer. Elijah continued. "At first, I intended to acquire Whitman Industries. He looked around the room. Because I believed the company could be fixed. He paused for a second. Then he said the sentence that made the entire room fall silent. But after tonight, I realized that company might need to answer to the law instead. At that moment, the ballroom doors opened. 2 men in black suits walked in. One of them held up a badge. Charles Whitman? His voice rang out clearly. We're federal agents. We have a search warrant. The entire ballroom fell silent. The 2 agents stood at the entrance, the crystal lights reflecting off the silver badges on their chests. Small conversations immediately died out. Every eye turned toward Charles Whitman. The man who once commanded the attention of the entire room now stood still for several seconds. He looked at the warrant in the agent's hand, then slowly raised his eyes toward Elijah. You did all of this because of a small misunderstanding? Charles asked. Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked around the room. The people who had laughed earlier when Sophie ordered him to wipe the floor were now avoiding his gaze. No, Elijah said. This started a long time ago. Sophie stepped forward. You think a few papers can destroy my family? Her voice tried to sound arrogant, but everyone could hear the tension behind every word. Elijah looked directly at her. I'm not the one destroying your family. He paused for a moment. It's what they've done. One of the agents stepped closer to Charles. Mr. Whitman, we need you to come with us. Charles remained standing there, as if calculating something. Then the phone of a nearby investor rang. The man looked at the screen, then muttered softly, Oh, God. Another person asked, What is it? The man swallowed. Whitman Industries stock has just been suspended from trading. The room truly erupted in murmurs now. News spread faster than any explanation. The video of Sophie spitting had appeared on every social media platform. But what truly panicked the market wasn't that video. It was the documents Elijah had just revealed. One investor turned to Charles. You told us everything was legal. Charles didn't answer. He only looked at Elijah. How long have you been preparing for this? He asked. Elijah answered simply, 2 years. Several people nearby inhaled sharply. 2 years. Elijah slowly walked toward the large screen. The image of the small riverside town was still displayed. Old houses, a small soccer field, and water murky with chemicals. Elijah Grant, a man in the crowd said, do you really think Whitman Industries is responsible for this? Elijah turned around. I don't think, he said. I know. He pointed at the screen. 3,000 waste transport trips over 6 years. The same location. The same contractor. The same approval signature. His eyes settled on Charles Whitman. Yours. Sophie shook her head. You're making this up. But her voice was no longer steady. A woman standing near the door stepped forward. It was Linda Alvarez, a former environmental engineer at Whitman Industries. I reported this, she said. The entire room turned to look at her. Linda continued. They fired me the next week. No one said anything. Charles sighed quietly. That silence said everything. One of the agents placed a hand on his shoulder. Mr. Whitman, we need to go now. This time, Charles didn't resist. Before turning away, he looked at Sophie. You should have learned to respect people sooner. That sentence left Sophie frozen. The ballroom doors closed behind Charles Whitman. The atmosphere in the room changed completely. The people who had once stood around Sophie began to leave. No one wanted to be seen standing beside her anymore. Sophie turned to Elijah. "You think you're a hero?" Elijah shook his head. "No." He looked back at the screen. "I'm just someone who couldn't stay silent anymore." A few weeks later, Whitman Industries officially declared bankruptcy. Banks froze all assets belonging to the Whitman family. The board of directors resigned, one after another. Companies that once partnered with them quickly cut all ties. As for Sophie Whitman, she appeared on the morning news standing outside a federal courthouse. No evening gown, no wealthy friends, only dozens of reporters. One of them asked, "Sophie, do you regret what happened that night?" She stayed silent for a few seconds, then turned away. At the same time in Louisiana, Elijah Grant stood in front of a new construction site. A water filtration system was being installed along the riverbank. Local families stood around, watching the first clean water flow out of the pipes. A reporter asked Elijah, "If Sophie Whitman hadn't insulted you that night, would things have been different?" Elijah thought for a few seconds. "Maybe I would still have bought their company." "So what made you change your decision?" Elijah looked at the flowing water. It wasn't the insult. He turned to look at the children running around the yard. It was the fact that they believed power gave them the right to look down on others. He paused. And sometimes, a single moment of arrogance is enough to expose everything. In the distance, clean water continued flowing through the new pipes, and the Whitman Empire had disappeared from Wall Street. Late afternoon in Parishville was quiet, completely different from the lavish party that night. Elijah stood beside the small river where the new water filtration system had just been completed. Crystal clear water flowed through the metal pipes, then poured out of the town's first public faucet. A little boy ran over, turned the faucet on, and shouted with excitement as the cool water poured out. His mother stood behind him, smiling softly, her eyes far more relieved than the stories Elijah had once heard about this place. Elijah watched the scene for a long time. He didn't say anything. Some things don't need to be said out loud. Seeing them change is enough. Rachel stood beside him and quietly asked, "Do you think it's all over now?" Elijah shook his head gently. "No, but at least the people here have a new beginning." He looked at the flowing water, then said slowly, "Sometimes people think power comes from how much money you have, or how high you stand. But in reality, it comes from how you treat others when no one is watching." The sun slowly dipped behind the small houses. Children's laughter still echoed near the new faucet. A place that had once been forgotten was now beginning to heal. If this story made you think, please press like, share it so more people can watch, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel Real Life Stories New to follow more meaningful real-life stories like this one.